Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the refreshments. This is, of course, the third session of the Qatar Climate Change Conference 2021. My name is Naweed Jabakil. I'm the UK and Europe correspondent at international news channel CGTN. It's actually the first time I've been back to Doha in a couple of years now because of the COVID pandemic, so very happy to be back in the Middle East. So the first two sessions, we heard a lot about the policy issues, more abstract issues around climate change, how individuals and governments can tackle the issue. For this session, the final one, we'll hope to dig a little bit deeper, maybe talk about the more specific issue about who pays for it, because at the end of the day, no matter how much we want to save the climate, there are financial costs involved with all of this. And the idea of carbon pricing and carbon markets, they've gathered a lot of headlines recently, mainly because China a few months ago decided to create the world's largest carbon market. It wasn't the first to do so. The European Union doing this about 15 years ago, and we'll hear from one country, Sweden, which has done this almost 30 years ago in terms of taxing carbon. So the idea gaining a lot of traction, it's seen as a good tool to fight emissions and possibly beneficial to not just companies but individuals and the wider community, of course, if the air gets cleaner for all of us. But as companies try and look to tackle climate change, take it more seriously, as we've been hearing across a wide range of industries, there are the questions of how important pricing carbon can be, and crucially, how it can be combined with other approaches as well, because no single thing is going to tackle this, as we've been hearing. We've got, I'm glad to say, a wide range of experienced leaders in the field joining us, some virtually, some here in person, to talk about carbon markets and carbon pricing, not just here in Qatar, but across the region and experiences elsewhere in the world. First up, before we get going then, I'd just like to welcome His Excellency, the Ambassador of Sweden here in Qatar, Dr. Anders Bengtsson. If you'd come up and say a few words. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for me to be here today to present Sweden's policy framework and financial incentives to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. This is Sweden, roughly the same size as California or Iraq. Industry is extremely important to Sweden, making up about 1/3 of the economy, and a considerable part of that industry is quite energy intensive. Things like paper pulp industry, steel mills, and also mining. Since the 1970s, increased energy efficiency and energy conservation have been policy objectives of the Swedish government. And since the end of the 1980s, early 1990s, the issue of reduction of greenhouse emissions have been a central objective of the Swedish government. So, what are the measures that have been taken to deliver on those central objectives? Well, this is energy tax, was introduced in the 70s, and in recent years, energy tax has more than doubled in the past 10 years. It's now something like 5 cents per kilo of carbon dioxide. This corresponds to 45 cents per liter of petrol. Then in 1991, a carbon tax was introduced, and gradually this tax increased, and now the carbon tax in Sweden is $137 per ton of carbon dioxide. That means that Sweden has the highest carbon tax in the world. Then, of course, Sweden is a member of the EU. That means that we're part of the EU emissions and trading system, which provides incentives to efficient facilities reducing their emissions of carbon dioxide. So how have these measures played out when it comes to energy efficiency and when it comes to reduction of greenhouse gases? Let's take a look at that. Here you can see that the energy consumption in the country has more or less stayed stable for the last 40 years, while the economy has grown, more than doubled, and industrial production also almost doubled in that period of time. Well, what about carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions? Here we can see that since 1990 until 2018, the emissions of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases have actually been reduced by 27%. And they will continue to be reduced with these policy measures down to about 45 metric ton carbon dioxide equivalents. However, that is not enough. The Swedish government and the parliament in Sweden have decided that we should go down all the way to 10 million ton carbon dioxide equivalents by 2045. How will that be possible? Well, the bulk of those reductions will have to be made in the sectors contributing the most. And as you can see here, the sectors contributing the most are industry and domestic transportation. So that's where the big reductions will have to be made. And recently, new measures have been introduced in each of those sectors. Let's take a look at what's happening in transportation. So these are some of the new measures recently introduced. This year, EU average emission targets for vehicles will be introduced that will have some bite. Nationally in Sweden, a carbon dioxide-based tax on vehicles has been introduced. There will be purchase bonuses for new cars with low or no emissions already in place. Tax incentives for company cars with low or no emissions. And there will be a gradual increase of biofuels in petrol and diesel. So by 2030, we will have 66% biofuels in diesel. And by the same year, 2030, we will have 28% biofuels in petrol. There will, of course, be premiums to public transportation authorities to procure buses with low or no emissions. And so what is the effect of these new measures? Well, we can see that registration of new vehicles from last year shows that more than 30% of new registered vehicles were either electric or hybrid. So things like electric buses and trucks. For this year, the first 4 months of this year, we see 37% of new registrations were either hybrid or electric. So huge change in consumer behavior, and consumers are going for electric. And this has also an effect on industry, because this means also that new industries are being developed. This is a battery factory in the northern part of Sweden, delivering batteries not only to Swedish automotive industry, but to automotive industry across the world. So those are some of the things that are happening in transportation. What about industry, the other sector which contributes so much in greenhouse gas emissions? Well, in industry, the realization is there that to really reduce in industry, one has to do away with fossil-based processes altogether. So that means new process technology not based on fossils. Steel production is a good example of that. For thousands of years, steel was produced using large amount of coal. 1 ton of steel, you need 800 kilos of coal. New process has been developed using hydrogen instead to reduce the iron. And that process is now commercially viable and is introduced in Swedish steel mills. And the byproduct is no longer huge amount of carbon dioxide, but I think, as someone earlier mentioned, clean water. Similar technology leaps are now taking place in other industries, like the cement industry, which also requires a lot of fossil. That is changing there as well. Not commercialized as well yet, but going to be soon, we hope. This is non-fossil steel being produced in a commercial steel plant, steel mill in Sweden. So these are some of the measures that are taking place in Sweden right now. We are, of course, keen to cooperate with Qatar in several of these fields where technology is being developed as we speak. Technology regarding smart solutions in transportation, digitalization, and new technology when it comes to industrial processes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, and we'll be seeing the Ambassador shortly for the panel discussion. We heard about a Swedish-European experience and the history that they have. Let's hear now from the Qatari side. Joining us for the next presentation is Mr. Saud Abdullah Al-Atiyah, the Deputy Undersecretary for Economic Affairs at Qatar's Finance Ministry.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you all in this presentation. I will provide an overview of Qatar within the context of climate change. This presentation will focus where we fit in within the global community, how we see climate regulation and development going forward, and the future plans. As Qatar, we are fully committed to growing our economy in a sustainable way. Cabinet approved National Climate Change Plan recently. It is part of Qatar's commitment to fighting climate change by diversifying our economy, building capabilities, and using the natural resources in the best possible manner. The plan was developed after a coordination within 50 entities in the country. It's also in line with the UN Sustainable Development Goals and Qatar's ambition in being one of the leaders in the region in limiting carbon emissions. Today, we observe that many countries, companies, and NGOs are trying to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. They use mandatory or voluntary mechanisms and exchange markets. Regarding the mandatory mechanism, these are merely compliance requirements based on multinational, national, or even regional commitments. Costs and regulatory requirements are the main decision factors for buyers when entities deal with the exchanges. Voluntary market has a little bit different dynamic where publicly announced decarbonization targets become important decision factors. This is still smaller share of the market, however, growing fast as many companies like Microsoft announced carbon neutral agenda. Although there is a progress in carbon emission initiatives, still only 20% of emissions are covered under these initiatives. As the number of exchanges and mechanisms are increasing, this share is also growing rapidly. GCC countries produce only 9% of the total carbon emissions, but still there is no fully operational carbon market in the region. Majority of carbon credit trading is based in EU, although the US and Chinese markets are growing rapidly. GCC countries can ignore the carbon high initiatives for a while to minimize business costs. However, reputational risks and potential positive economic benefits will require taking action sooner. We in Qatar are cooperating and supporting a global effort to cut carbon emissions. As part of the climate change strategy, we are studying the carbon market, and we are aware that scales and collective action is critical for successful implementations. We also need to consider that these initiatives should be planned with the longer time, since they take very long time to implement. For example, China is setting a target for 2060, achieve zero net emission target. As Qatar government, we do not look at carbon markets in isolation. It is part of the larger environmental, social, and governance framework. We are developing a balanced approach. One side of the scale involves our multilateral and local commitments. To realize this commitment, we have taken several actions, including $100 million voluntary contribution to support silver initiatives, where His Highness the Emir announced in the United Nations Climate Action Summit in 2019. Improve local building standards, investment in green bonds, and several local energy efficiency initiatives. Other side of the scale involve the facts that Qatar is still at the very early stage of its development process. Our energy production mostly consumed outside of Qatar, and we are living in a desert climate. These three factors should be considered while our partner are assessing the emissions for Qatar. We are a leader of natural gas exports, which is considered much environment friendly compared to the traditional hydrocarbon source like coal and oil. Also, the small population of Qatar causes per capita emissions to look very high, although our ranking in total emission are much lower. We already have a high cost of doing business. We need to be very careful when we introduce a new cost to the businesses, which will make them uncompetitive in the world arena. Finally, I would like to affirm that the institutions in Qatar are looking into a policy and regulatory options to minimize the distribution and maximize the impact of carbon pricing. We believe that carbon pricing is an effective regulatory tool to incentivize the private sector to innovate and shift the greener methods of production, distribution, and consumptions. A transition and gradual approach are important considerations. As Qatar powers its ambitious economic diversification program, the mix of economic activities will provide greater opportunity for a fully developed and functioning domestic carbon market. We have been exploring several options to develop carbon market in Qatar by being specialized in various sectors or being a hub of creditor purchasers. Lastly, the introduction of carbon pricing is no longer a choice, but therefore our efforts have increased, and we hope to come up with a credible plan soon. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Mr. Al-Attiyah. I'm glad to say that he'll be joining us for the panel discussion as well. Before we get to that, just a quick video as well we have from another important speaker. We heard from Sweden, we heard from Qatar, but this is a global problem, as we've been told, and it's going to require a global response. Here's one from the United States. This is the Director of Greenhouse Gases and Climate Change at Exxon Mobil, Mr. Pete Trellenberg.
Good morning, and thank you to Her Excellency Sheikha Hind bint Hamad Al Thani, Vice Chairperson and CEO of the Qatar Foundation, and to His Excellency Abdullah bin Hamad Al Attiyah, Chairman of the Board of Trustees for the Abdullah bin Hamad Al Attiyah International Foundation, for convening this important dialogue. As many of you know, Exxon Mobil affiliates have enjoyed a relationship with Qatar for more than 80 years. Exxon Mobil has partnered with Qatar Petroleum to develop the North Field, the world's largest non-associated natural gas field. We're also part of the Qatar Gas joint venture, and for more than a decade, our scientists and researchers based at Exxon Mobil Research Qatar have advanced projects in environmental management, water reuse, LNG safety, and coastal geology. Today, our growing global society needs reliable and affordable energy. Quite simply, it makes modern life possible. At the same time, society is asking that its energy be provided with a lower carbon footprint. Today's technology, including carbon capture, hydrogen, and advanced biofuels, is critical, and so are tomorrow's technological breakthroughs and supportive government policies that encourage sustained investments in the energy transition. On the issue of policy, ExxonMobil believes that carbon markets and pricing can be powerful tools in reducing CO2 emissions around the world. A properly constructed price on carbon is the single most effective way to reduce emissions at the lowest cost to society. We have supported such a price for more than a decade. Carbon pricing would be effective for a few important reasons. First, it would create a clear incentive for companies to operate more efficiently, reduce relative demand for high emissions goods and services, and encourage companies to invest in proven technologies like carbon capture and storage. ExxonMobil has been capturing and storing carbon for decades. We've captured more human-made CO2 than any other company, and our new low-carbon solutions business is advancing potential commercial opportunities to scale up carbon capture and storage technology in higher emitting locations with heavy industrial activities. One of those is Houston, where we announced plans for a CCS innovation zone earlier this year. Carbon capture could have great potential in Qatar, along with other technologies like blue hydrogen, which is made from natural gas and accompanied by carbon capture. Both will require government policy support to be developed and deployed at a scale large enough to meaningfully reduce emissions. The pricing systems created so far are a patchwork that covers only some parts of the globe. There is the European Union emissions trading system, and there are regional initiatives in the US, Canada, and China, based on purchasing the right to emit carbon dioxide. In Australia, we have a government-funded reverse auction scheme to purchase abatement from industry. Because much of the world doesn't have carbon pricing, it's important to ensure that any pricing policy does not encourage emissions leakage across borders. To that end, policymakers should consider coupling a carbon pricing policy with a border carbon adjustment, thereby maintaining competitiveness of exported products such as LNG. Exxon Mobil supports harmonizing systems across countries. Emissions are emissions, regardless of where they originate. Governments will have the further decision of how to manage the revenue the new markets create. One beneficial use of these revenues could be to help domestic companies improve greenhouse gas performance and encourage investments in technology solutions. We believe society as a whole would benefit if these and related issues are discussed and advanced at the COP26 meeting in November. In the meantime, Exxon Mobil is committed to playing an important role as the world continues to pursue lower carbon energy solutions. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak and for organizing this important conference.
That was Pete Trellenberg from Exxon Mobil. We can start the panel discussion now. First of all, I'd just like to invite the two speakers back up, please. So, Your Excellency Ambassador Benson and Mr. Alatia as well. We do have a few virtual guests joining us as well, with plenty of expertise. First of all, Mr. David Antonioli, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Vera Standards. Hopefully he's going to pop up shortly, as the name suggests. Hi, David. The organization is instrumental in developing and managing standards around climate change. Our next panelist is Mr. Wai Shin Chan, Global Head of the HSBC Climate Change Center of Excellence. Hi there, Wai Shin. And then lastly, but by no means least, Ms. Fenella Awan, who's the Head of Carbon Pricing Global Practice at the Global Green Growth Institute. Hi, Fenella. Thank you for joining us. Great. So let's kick things off then. Ambassador, I'd like to start with you, if you will. We saw from your presentation, you mentioned how Sweden has a history and experience of when it comes to taxing carbon and carbon pricing. Just tell us a bit about how that's worked out for you. I read something interesting that since 1990 until 2013, your GDP grew by about 50% despite these high levels of taxation. How do you manage that?
Well, I think that the Swedish example shows that both carbon taxes and carbon trading actually works. It works to reduce emissions, but it also works to increase competitiveness in industry, because what this has done, it has created more efficient use of resources. It has helped us increase productivity in the country, and actually also increased creativity, as we've had to invent new products, more efficient products, to stay competitive, because as Qatar, Sweden is also highly dependent on exports. We're an export-oriented country and rely on the exports, and our ability to be on our toes, to be inventive, has actually benefited by these systems of taxation, by these system of trading. So it's been very good and beneficial to reducing emissions, but also to invigorate creativity and innovation in the country.
Great. Coming to you, Mr. Alatia, obviously each country looks at this differently, despite the fact that we're looking for global standards around it. When you just did your presentation, I've written down something that jumped out at me here. We already have high costs for doing business in Qatar. If you do start taxing more and look at carbon pricing, is that going to make Qatar and its LNG or other industries less competitive?
I believe yes, and we do have a higher cost of doing business here in Qatar, and we are in the government now working so hard to reduce these costs, especially from the regulatory costs point of view. Introducing a new initiative like the economic court, which will reduce the cost of the course and etc. But again, as I mentioned in my presentation, we are still a small market, and the scale of economy is not available right now in Qatar. So this is why we are working collectively with our partner and also with the region in the GCC to come up with the common market, the GCC common market and the custom unions, where it's all open, more market to each other. But again, as I mentioned in my presentation, I believe we need to be careful, and we need to have a mid and a long-term high approach to introduce, such as a more costs in the businesses in Qatar. Now, as I mentioned again, also we in the cabinet, the cabinet approved the climate change document, the strategy, and I think His Excellency, the Minister of Municipality and Environment, he was here before, and he explained that. And we are taking this as a baseline for our green economy strategy, where we have so many initiatives, and one of the initiatives is the carbon market exchange high initiatives.
David, I'm going to throw this across to you because you've just heard two different countries there, two different views. How difficult does that make your job, trying to standardize the industry across the globe and make sure everyone's playing by the same rules?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to speak here. It's an honor, and it's great to hear the discussion. Let me just be clear that what we do is we set standards around projects that reduce or remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So our job isn't really to standardize things across the board. That said, I think every country is going to develop its own solution, and it's going to have its own rules. Ultimately, I think, every country needs to, have a system and a plan to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions and get to that net zero state that will avoid us, pumping more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And how exactly that happens is really going to depend on the particulars of each country and the rules that it sets, and the rules that make the most sense. I mean, if you're in a tropical country, you can probably rely on forests a fair bit. In Qatar, you don't have forests, so you have to rely on probably new technologies and other solutions that make most sense for Qatari. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Wai Shin, to come to you and HSBC's Global Centre of Excellence, looking at this from a financial perspective, because that's really important as well. The price of carbon, that's something that is quite a hot topic. Some say it should be closer to $100 per tonne. We heard 137 from Sweden, the highest in the world. What sort of price range do you think works, or is this something that you can't really put a figure on?
I think you can't really put a figure on it in general. Different things, as David said, work for different countries. I mean, you've got to think about the market conditions, the developmental state of the economy, the climate commitments of the jurisdiction, and the level of support you actually have from businesses and the public. So it is difficult to say. I think one direction I'd like to put on it is that it should start off and grow. So whichever the price is at the moment, it should grow into the future with clear communication that is coming. The whole idea of carbon pricing is that we want to be nudging behavior. We don't necessarily need to be changing it today, right now, by putting on the highest price in the world, but bringing this in at a reasonable pace and communicating the benefits of that to all the stakeholders involved, and especially telling them that this will continue to increase into the future so that we can change the behavior, as everyone has already said, in the form of decarbonization and reducing emissions.
Thank you. Fenella, I might just put the same question to you and just tweak it a little bit, particularly around the issue of technologies, which is something that we've heard from most of the panelists here. How much higher do you think prices need to go? I mean, the IMF said in 2019 the average price was $2 per metric ton. Mark Carney, the UN's climate envoy, says it needs to be closer to 100.
Hi, and again, thank you to the Qatar Foundation and the organisers for inviting me today. Yes, where should the price be? It's the difference probably between those two quotes is where carbon was pricing and aspirationally where the social cost of carbon is. So how do we price everything in? And I think Wei Xin said it quite cleverly in the sense that there's no point hitting too hard with the stick straight away. You need to gently bring in policy, be clear about it. Government needs to be clear on the direction of policy so that if you are a steel producer in Qatar and you are looking at technology that Sweden can offer, you can bring this technology, you know that the price of carbon is on a track going upwards, therefore you can carefully predict the price and work out exactly where and when you need to switch your technology. So all of these pricing mechanisms, whether it's a tax or whether it's a cap, you need to find the balance to change behavior. You need to ensure that your tax is not so low that people are just happy to pay the tax on the petrol, but will carry on driving around in petrol vehicles, but is not so high that you then create disincentive, you create economic damage. So it's all about finding the balance. Where the correct price is, mystery at the moment, but it's varying levels depending on what you include in that price.
That's fine, don't worry, I wasn't expecting an exact answer, but yeah, just to come back to you, thank you, Fenella. You mentioned social cost and how important that is to get people on board with this. Ambassador, Sweden, high levels of taxation in Scandinavia. They're used to paying tax and enjoying good government services. That might not be reparable elsewhere in the world. Do you think that that's a difference, the fact that your population is environmentally friendly generally, and it's easier for them to digest carbon pricing and taxes?
Well, I think several points here. First of all, the gentle introduction, I think that's a very wise approach. The high carbon tax that we see now in Sweden is something that was introduced over a period of 30 years. Now, regarding social cost, the beauty of both of these systems, the carbon tax system and the trade-in system, is that both of those systems create revenues for government and for finance ministries. And it's, of course, up to finance ministries to distribute those revenues in a way that they see fit. Now, if there is an issue related to socially vulnerable persons not being able to perhaps afford a high electricity bill, you could think of smart ways of actually funding those peoples, either through a subsidy or some other way, so that there are intelligent ways of reducing social costs.
And a similar question to you, Mr. Al-Attiyah. In terms of Qatar, it's probably the opposite. The population has enjoyed subsidies for quite a long time. How difficult, particularly as someone who comes from the Ministry of Finance, how difficult do you think it is to sell carbon taxes and paying more for the environment to Qataris?
You know, in Ministry of Finance, we are very careful, and we doesn't like the word of subsidies. It's keep us away from to diversify our revenue. But yes, we are still subsidizing a lot of social services here in Qatar. And now in the Ministry of Finance, now we are working with one of two of the international financial institutions to develop our ESG framework, where we will look in details how we need to or what we need to subsidize and how we can introduce these type of, let's say, I don't want to name it tax now, but name of tariffs or something like this to reduce the greenhouses.
And David, we've been hearing a bit about the government's role and individuals' roles in the past few minutes, but businesses matter in this as well. I mean, especially if you look at pricing, one of the key arguments for higher pricing is to push responsibility essentially onto those who are responsible for causing the emissions. Do you think that there's a moral case to be made for businesses to pay more?
I think there's a moral case for all of us to do more, right? What I think has happened, at least in the world that we see, which is the voluntary carbon market, is that today, when companies measure their greenhouse gas emissions, they create a greenhouse gas footprint. And that, in today's world, is essentially a new liability that companies have to deal with. So there's now incredible pressure on companies to reduce that footprint internally, and in many cases, to invest in projects that further reduce it or compensate those greenhouse gas emissions. So I think there is an imperative that we all do our part. And of course, I think one of the reasons companies are doing this is that many companies are realizing that this is a business opportunity, because they see that being a leader in the fight on climate change can actually be good for business. Now that doesn't square across the entire economic spectrum, but it is an important driver for what we're seeing for action, particularly because governments are not moving as fast as we need to. And that's really leaving many companies to step up.
And Wai Shin, to pick up on the issue of businesses, HSBC, obviously one of the biggest banks in the world, businesses generally, Wai Shin, they don't really like taxes, they don't like increased costs. Do you think that's true, or do they actually want to clean up their image and care about the environment, Wai Shin?
That's a fun question to answer. I don't think they don't like increased costs or anything like that. It has to be done for the right reason. Sure, businesses need to make a profit, but they do need to make sure the benefits are appropriately shared across all stakeholders. And so, the costs of carbon need to be thought out. Why are we actually wanting to price carbon? I mean, carbon pricing is a mechanism that tries to capture the external costs of emissions. So what are these external costs? They're actually very difficult to quantify, but they broadly cover the costs that the general public may incur, things like asset damage or loss or crop damage and healthcare in the future, as well as all the extreme events that we're seeing. So we have to be working with, I think, businesses of all shapes and sizes and in all sectors to say, hang on, how are we contributing to the livability of the planet and the livelihoods of everyone? Because the planet is no good if it doesn't function as it should in terms of natural capital, biodiversity, ecosystems. And also business doesn't work if a segment of the societies that we operate in are unable to participate in the economy. So if we're destroying livelihoods, that doesn't work at all. So businesses are very, very entitled to make their profit, but they have to make it within the bounds of what the planet and society can actually accept. And carbon pricing is a way to sort of bring that cost back to bear for the businesses themselves. So what we want to be doing at HSBC is helping our clients to change their business models in the future to at least fit in with not only the transition to a low carbon world, but hopefully in the future net zero as it should be done.
Thank you, Wai Shin. And Fenella, I just wanted to come to you because I got your notes from before this session, and you mentioned something about how we need to make sure it's not the poorest people in society who benefit least from these sorts of measures. If you just tell us a bit more about your thinking there.
I think this comes through a sort of just transition, and fairness is very important. So, if we take a prime example of this, the Gilets jaunes moment in France, many felt that was just a demonstration against a carbon tax. It actually was a little more nuanced than that. It was a demonstration by small independent hauliers about a carbon tax as compared to the larger hauliers who were going to be able to offset that carbon tax against other taxes they paid. thereby the small independent players were going to be hit more than the larger hauliers, and therefore squeezed out of the market. So this was about being fair. It's also about ensuring that governments are honest about the redistribution, as His Excellency the Ambassador mentioned. For example, in Colombia, there has been a fuel tax that has been gathered by the government, and there were demonstrations because there have been delays in the redistribution of that tax to specifically green initiatives as initially promised. So I think there needs to be transparency and clear policy from governments that allow people to understand the reasons for taxes, and that allows a much better understanding. And if you gather a tax, as His Excellency said, you can redistribute that in order to even it up. So in Qatar, on the side of energy, to change behavior, it is a movement of the support for the cost of the towards greener solutions. We've seen fantastic moves by Qatar recently. The first commercially large-scale solar project is up and running this year. So there is already some great movements by the country. And, as said by Exxon Mobil, large amounts of activity to reduce emissions in the LNG sector as well.
Ambassador, I just wanted to throw that point across to you, the idea of this being intrinsically regressive tax. Poor people have to light their homes, they have to use electricity, food and water. What are your thoughts on trying to mitigate that impact?
As I said before, I think there are excellent ways of redistributing that revenue which the government will acquire as a result of both the trading system and the carbon tax. And that's really up to governments what kind of redistribution profile they would want to have. But the possibility is certainly there to do that.
Great, and we've spoken about pricing and taxation. I just wanted to talk about the other theme in this session, which is the carbon market. You mentioned in your presentation, Ambassador, the European Union has taken somewhat of a lead, at least globally, on this back to the mid-2000s, and it was the world's largest until China's recently overtook it. Just tell us about that experience and what role carbon markets can play.
So I think, it's been around now for 15, 16 years. I think the market trading system was introduced back in 2005. And after some trial and error, I think the trading system is now running quite smoothly. It covers something like 10,000 facilities throughout the European Union. In my own country, around 800 facilities are covered. That means that something like 40% of all the emissions in the EU are covered by this system. And it's an effective system in the sense that allowances are given to all facilities. And those facilities, let's say factories, that are efficient and are not using their full allowances can sell allowances to less efficient facilities who will suffer. They will have to pay for those allowances, or they will have to clean up their act. And gradually, of course, the cap in this system is gradually lowered, and there is a squeeze on all facilities to become more efficient. So I think after a few glitches initially, this system is working quite well now.
And Mr. Latia, looking at Qatar, you mentioned the idea of a GCC, that's Gulf Cooperation Council market. 9% of emissions, the region's responsible for global emissions, but still no standardized markets in the region. Just tell us a bit about what impact you think that could make for Qatar and the region.
Again, I think it's It's all under the studying now process, and we are in talking with the GCC Council and the other countries now. Far of my understanding, Saudi, they launched their carbon market exchange, and it is in the first phase now. The idea here how we can jointly go together, because our market is very small comparing with the other market, and as well as the limited of the companies who's working in this field as well is very small. So there is a lot of discussion now with the council. There is a lot of discussion now even internally, but all that depends on how we will take this forward to find and to design the right mechanism and the right regulatory, which will not impact into our businesses and into our process for the infrastructure development and the other. Qatar introduced a lot of high initiatives in this field. All of our stadiums are green building, green bonds also we will issue very soon. QIA already invested in the green bonds overseas. So there's a lot of high efforts, but regarding the carbon market exchange, we are still exploring which one is the right design and mechanism to launch this market, especially with the small size of our market.
Thank you. David, so the idea of another regional carbon market perhaps coming up, you've just heard about there. How important a role do you think the markets play, especially when trying to standardize things across borders?
Mm-hmm. Well, markets can be very powerful, and I think the example in Europe is a great example. There were some glitches, and there's a lot of knowledge and insights as to how you can best design these markets. But they can work, right? In the end of the day, what those markets do is they put a price on carbon, and they start to, as that price increases, it starts to favor alternatives, and that's ultimately what we need. So markets can be good. They need to be designed very carefully. But in many ways, you can think of a bigger market as better because you'll have more liquidity. You'll have more opportunities for investment as there are more diverse opportunities for investing in new opportunities. So I think, it's not to say that necessarily, bigger is better, but in some cases, markets are tricky. And I think the example in the European Union is a testament to the Union really working through a lot of issues that the market in the early days. Today, that market's working quite well. So you need to have really good design, but you need to be flexible to make sure that you're adjusting if you need to, because you may not get everything right at the beginning. But certainly giving that long-term direction and having that clear-eyed view as to where you want to go is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems to be a learning curve for all stakeholders. Why shouldn't it come to you? How much enthusiasm is there among the world of business then about carbon markets?
I think there's quite a lot of enthusiasm. They certainly want visibility on how carbon is going to be priced. They know it's coming. They've been buying their time by doing internal carbon pricing and so on and so forth. But they really want to know just how much do we need to budget this. And as David just said, that over time and through the glitches that happened in Europe, it is working. So this is definitely something that's going to be priced across various markets in the world. It's even going to be discussed in some different form at COP26 under Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement. But definitely businesses are looking for clarity on what they should do. Some projects will not be profitable when the carbon price is above a certain level. So this visibility is very, very important. Governments need to be very, very clear on how they intend the price of carbon to go. And this works in a number of ways. You can be reducing the cap by an increasing amount, as is happening in the EU, certainly in phase 4 of the ETS there. Or you can be saying we're looking for a floor price, as is designed in the UK, I think it is, and they're saying that's possibly going to increase over time. So this visibility is very, very important. There comes a point where you can become ever more efficient, and that's wonderful, or you can trade and so forth in the markets, but there will come a time where you say, okay, enough's enough. we're going to completely change our business model and not invest in that capex to expand the existing carbon activities. And we're going to change that so that we're zero carbon activities. And that will be a very, very interesting time indeed. But they need visibility on when that might happen for them as they plan, not just next year, but 5, 10, 15, 20, and for some sort of large assets, 40, 50 years into the future.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's those sorts of considerations are happening in boardrooms all across the world. As you mentioned, Mr. Alatia, it's long-term planning, at least for the state of Qatar. A final word to you then, Fenella. This is the first time I've realized I've done an energy thing without mentioning COP26, but in a long time. But it gives the world a real chance to try and forge ahead with joined-up thinking. A final word to you then on carbon markets, and particularly this idea that it's going to benefit big business. They can easily absorb losses here by buying elsewhere. Or do you think this is something that's really going to be impactful?
Well, yeah, COP26, we can't avoid it. And we're looking forward to the finalisation of the Paris rulebook by finally getting Article 6 decided. And, I think businesses prefer markets than taxes because it allows them to find the lowest cost to comply or to offset. But I want to just mention an earlier point that Mr. Al-Attiyah mentioned about Qatar being a small market, but also looking at the prospect of being a hub. What we have spoken about so far is domestic trading schemes. I say domestic, but they can be regional. So the Chinese scheme, the US scheme, the ETS, and looking at the GCC. We must also not ignore the international market, which is effectively a global market. And what this allows actors to do is participate in carbon pricing without having to set up an entire ETS nationally. Now, previously under Kyoto, that was a problem because it just meant that emission reductions or carbon credits moved around the world and there wasn't actually an overall reduction. Here, under Paris, there's an added concept of corresponding adjustments to make sure that there is no double counting so that when emission reductions are used, they're only used once. There's no reason why Qatar could not become the sort of hub and spoke player within the international market, especially linking with private businesses. So looking at that aviation or shipping industry by saying, we will help purchase from other countries, we will take on the responsibility of corresponding adjustment and retire those credits, which we then may sell, could be bought by Exxon Mobil or other players within the market. And that allows the avoidance of double counting. Switzerland have just recently announced in the last 24 hours that they're investigating this kind of idea. So there are opportunities for Qatar outside of just domestic or regional markets. And I think that could really benefit businesses that may have liabilities within Qatar greatly.
Brilliant. An optimistic note then to finish on. I just wanted to thank all of our virtual guests first. Fenella Awan from GGGI, thank you very much for being with us. Wai Shin Chan from HSBC, and of course Mr. David Antonioli from Vera. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you for the panelists here. Ambassador, thank you for your time, and Mr. Alatia, thank you for yours. Ladies and gentlemen, just before we finish, a quick mention from the Qatar Foundation. I believe Mr. Saud Al-Thani is going to have a quick closing remarks, and then if you can please stay around, there's going to be a group photo as well for everyone. If you'd like to take part, that's going to happen here. Mr. Al-Thani.
Distinguished guests, I believe we have made the most of knowledge sharing event by tackling the hot core issues of climate change, national policies, the action mitigations and adaptation, and the immediate roles and responsibility of public and private sector. Events like this are essential for the increasing synergy that will hopefully drive more actions against climate change and to preserve our planet and protect humanity as we know it. For the past few months, we have witnessed natural catastrophes that we had never seen likes of which ever before. Hurricanes, landslides, heat waves, and wildfires. Climate change pressure are real and urgent. Our world cannot afford to wait much longer for innovation in low-emission technology or follow the usual path for gradual action from the most developed countries to the developing ones. Let me put my final message simply and directly. Global climate change policies, whether adaptation or mitigation, will succeed if and only if our action is collective and without further delay. Finally, I thank you all for your presence today and your valuable contribution to the forum. Please keep putting up the good fight against climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Al-Thani. And just lastly, before we let you go, a reminder that there's the group photo in here. A quick thank you to the Qatar Foundation, who, as my colleagues Stephen and Nathan have said, are doing great work. The Al Attiyah Foundation as well. You can stay up to date with their latest on their websites and on Twitter at Al Attiyah FNDN. Thank you to Exxon Mobil as well, the sponsor. And just lastly, a thank you to the technical team who've been absolutely brilliant with all the technical sound. It's rare that you have so many online guests and not many hiccups. So, and lastly, thank you everyone for being here and making this such an enjoyable day. There will be refreshments there once again. Thank you.